Hi everyone, thanks for joining us for this episode of Cross Currents, where we take economics and policy and we unpack the impacts on your portfolio. I'm Ben Fawcett, Portfolio Manager and VP at Canaccord Genuity, and with me, as always, is Rod Phillips, Vice Chairman, Canaccord Genuity, and former Finance Minister of Ontario. Rod, great to be speaking to you again. There's a lot to go through.
It's a busy time.
It's a very busy time.
Yeah.
So perhaps we'll start off with Carney's report card, first 60 days. There's a number of areas I wanted to go through, but let's start with the trade update. It's been trade discussions off and then trade discussions back on. Where do we stand at the moment?
So I think by any standard, the last 60 days are certainly much better than the 60 days before that and the 60 days before that. So it's been a marked improvement. It is difficult for any new government and any new prime minister to take over. And taking over at a time like this with all of the uncertainty. On one hand, a lot of expectations coming out of the election. But on the other hand, I think people are cheering for the prime minister. So I've certainly found, and I talked to folks who would have been voting for the Conservatives, would have been voting for the NDP, voted for Mark Carney. But I think most Canadians are rooting for him and for his government to be successful. They talk about the political honeymoon. So I think he's been going through that. But we are coming up on some important dates. He's talked about a trade deal this month. And I think quite boldly, I think a lot of political advisors would have said, don't be that clear.
July 21st.
They also made commitments around dealing with interprovincial trade barriers by Canada Day, which was this week, and he did that to some extent, the extent
C5,
that he could. He talked about C5, which we'll talk about. So I think we've seen an aggressive agenda, but we've seen a very assertive prime minister. And to be fair, we've seen certainly the Conservative Party federally and a lot of the premiers, at least tentatively, and in some cases really wholeheartedly lining up behind those initiatives in a way that really is a change. And so I think Canadians can be encouraged, but I think we're in for an important month in terms of a lot of things that are going to happen. I also think with Mr. Trump and with the world as it is, it isn't going to be over till it's over, which might not be for a while. So I think Mr. Carney's faced the challenges he has to so far quite well, but I think there's more, probably of the more difficult challenges on the horizon.
Yeah. I think it's interesting with the last 3 days we've had the digital service tax, which was implemented in 2021, or the legislation was, and then at the last moment it was repealed after Trump walked away from the negotiating table. There's been a lot of press on that and the implications there and what that meant as far as Carney's negotiation. But again, I think, this is part of Trump's art of the deal to some extent, where there is the rug pull before you get a final deal. And this potentially is something that Carney was always going to have to contend with and would have to make concessions in a very public sort of way. And this could be an example. I
think you're exactly right. And I mean, that arguably was a bit of an own goal. It was the implementation of that tax that triggered, arguably one choice would have been to delay, defer, or otherwise in the whole, piece. I'm not sure what you think, but I'm not sure Canadians are going to, it matters in the moment. What's going to matter is the end result.
Yeah.
And I think you've put it exactly correct. I think there needs to be, there's going to be a bit of a challenge. And in some ways there's going to be public parts of that as a part of dealing with Trump. And as important as it is to get what you want, I think knowing when, as they say, when to hold them and when to fold them.
Yeah.
And to me and to a lot of people watching, the pretty obvious answer was what he did.
Yeah.
But it's yesterday's news. And now people are focused on going forward.
And you do need those photo ops where Canada caved. I'm afraid there's going to be part of those in this negotiation.
And it's not going to be done gracefully.
Yeah.
It's going to look like what it is.
Yeah. Step 7 and after the deal is, announce a deal and it's the most amazing deal in the history of time, sort of thing. So
the real question, I think, I'd be interested in what you think about this, but how likely it is that whatever deal we get, the president is going to stick to. And I think that, at least from my perspective, but I'd be interested in what you see. Business in many ways and investors want certainty.
Yeah.
And in some ways, that's the one thing that is going to be challenging. So a better deal would be better than a worse deal, obviously, but a deal that sticks and that is good enough might be most important.
Yes.
Versus if you almost have to risk, if you negotiated too good a deal, then the fear of a retrade, is higher.
I think there's some easy sort of gimmies in this one, and the DST would be one example. The digital services tax, increased military spending, which we can touch on. And again, there's a lot of accounting gimmicks you can actually use from that standpoint. I think Carney's quite well versed there. So there are areas that you can give Trump a victory, deal with some of the issues from the first deal he negotiated, and then rescind it to some extent that will probably give certainty, come up with a deal that we can get across the line. And then he will leave, hopefully, the balance of his term.
Makes sense.
The base case from that standpoint. Perhaps moving on to the next piece, BC5. This is the legislation to fast track large projects and also some interprovincial trade aspects in it. Your thoughts on the legislative agenda there?
So again, I think showing not just intent but action was what the Prime Minister was after. I think the provincial premiers, I'd say universally, pretty much universally, I think with British Columbia has been a little bit of an outlier, but almost universally have lined up, very, the previous government, the previous Prime Minister was not one to be having in-person, face-to-face meetings. And this Prime Minister and the premiers met in Saskatchewan a few weeks ago, had discussions about what would be these national interest projects. So simultaneously, imagine doing two things at once. This is not something we've come to expect from government, but simultaneously moving the piece of enabling legislation through while also having the discussion about what those priority projects would be.
Yeah.
Certainly the conversations around Ottawa is that the Prime Minister has said he wants 6 to 8 of these projects, and the discussions in Saskatchewan were very much about starting with a big list and starting to move down to those. And I think we can expect to see those certainly over the course of the summer in terms of those priorities. What would those priorities mean? They would mean faster approvals. He's talked about moving from 5 years to 2 years, which again, for those not in the approval space, that may seem like a long time, 2 years, but there's quite a bit of complexity to these major, whether they're pipelines or major housing initiatives or some of the things they've talked around ports and other things are significant challenging projects, energy transmission projects, all on the list. I think notable as well has been, and I think we've seen a bit of this in the Ontario context as well, what does this mean about engagement with First Nations? And I think we saw two approaches there, a similar bill that also happened to be Bill 5 in the Ontario legislature, moving similar enabling capacity through, ran into some opposition that the Premier had to deal with from a First Nation perspective. Similarly, although to a lesser extent at the federal level, that those issues came up, and I think we saw two slightly different ways of approaching the same issue. But the bottom line, I think, has to be that people are working on, and leaders, both First Nations leaders, but also our political leaders, are addressing these issues.
Yeah.
So I would anticipate these projects of national interest, whether they're in the mining space or the resource space beyond that, the pipelines space, housing has been identified, or electricity transmission, we'll start to see these announced. And then, of course, it'll be another time for action. The intention will be clear. Now, what does it mean? And where do those interprovincial approvals, with all the goodwill out there, where do they overlap and how do things really move along? And back to the investment component, how does that change the investment climate so people go, wow, up in Canada, they can actually get something done again.
Yeah.
And I think that will be the measure this time a year from now is, do the markets, do Canadians, do project proponents believe, maybe they can do something like this.
And invest in Canada again. Yeah, I was impressed by how widespread support was in the House of Commons and how quickly it passed, especially when you consider some of the powers given to the cabinet in this legislation. I think the other side is when I sort of listen to natural resources ministers in, say, BC, Alberta, and Quebec, it's clear that the feds are going to have to come with a very big checkbook as well to get these across the line.
I mentioned the First Nations component. There's an interesting trend. I mean, one of the ways, the requirement and duty to both advise and consult and discuss with First Nations these types of projects where they impact their traditional territories. The new component, and it is a fundamentally new component, is this idea of equity ownership and significant, in many cases, majority equity ownership. And very recently, both in Ontario and federally. In Ontario, the Aboriginal Opportunities Fund, which was originally a fund related to electricity expansion, was expanded from $1 billion to $3 billion. The federal government doubled a very similar fund from $5 billion to $10 billion. This is meant to be enabling dollars that could be then used to essentially a loan guarantee program to provide the underlying equity for specific First Nations, either individual First Nations or collections of First Nations, to be able to invest. So example, the Arctic Gateway, which is a First Nations owned corporation, which has 41 First Nations as a part of it, but essentially owns the Churchill Port, the Churchill tank farms, the Churchill Railway, the Churchill Airport. That's an example. Churchill has been a port talked about potentially as an access to tidewater. So will that become one of the national interest projects? Will those kinds of funds be mobilized in Manitoba in that case and federally to try to enable the kind of ownership and equity requirement? And then how will that link? If it's going to be if that's going to be a port, well, then I guess you would look a little bit to the west and you say, well, is there natural gas in Saskatchewan? And so you can start to see these things fitting together. But of course, the complexity of making that work is a whole nother level. And I think one of the very open questions is going to be how will we've talked about how investors will respond, but how will the various bureaucracies and other agencies respond to this idea of a prime minister and premiers that are going, is it done yet?
Yes. How quickly are they going to be able to move in this situation where nothing has for a while? Perhaps moving on to NATO summit. Some interesting communications coming out of that we don't need to go through to some extent. Canada did reaffirm its 2% commitment to GDP. Again, just from a perspective as far as the amounts of dollars involved there, Canada said they'll spend an extra $9 billion in spending by 2026, so moving forward the targets. Interestingly, 2% of GDP would actually require spending about up to $20+ billion. But again, under NATO rules, there's all sorts of accounting aspects. You can take icebreakers and coast guards and pension plans and incorporate that into the spending. So it is achievable to some extent. Any thoughts as far as those security commitments?
Listen, I think it's interesting how the confluence of events, the United States has for a very long time, and other NATO allies, when it comes to Canada, have pointed out that we have underspent against the commitment that we had made. So just from a doing what you said you do point of view, and I think Canada's credibility on the world stage, but among that group of partners, this was necessary. Somewhat ironically, our lack of confidence in our southern neighbor, and even some would say our anxiety about what that southern neighbor does, creates another incentive to say, we probably do need to be able to, not only meet our commitments, but defend our borders. I mean, as someone said to me through the whole 51st state discussion, if you can't defend it, do you really own it? Right?
Yes.
If I go home today and there's some guy sitting in my living room and I can't get him to leave, is it my house or is it his house?
No, it's a good point.
And so I think that these are all necessary things. I think the next step, as you know, is to talk about a 5% commitment, which has been made in the long term. In that case, 3.5% of that would be more the core defense elements. And some of the things like we've talked about ports and other infrastructure could account for the others. I don't think any of these are out of line with the priorities that both the Prime Minister, but I think Canadians feel. However, in government, that will always come down to the question then of trade-offs, because none of the underlying challenges, whether it's around healthcare expenditures or other issues, have gone away. And there are a finite amount of dollars, publicly available dollars, and how, as you mentioned, things like pension funds and other areas are brought in to help galvanize those investments is going to be very important. But boy, this is a conversation. There's a Chinese proverb about the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The next best time is today, right? So it's good that we're getting to that conversation today.
Which does lead to the next question. They're spending right now and the commitments to spend and planning, and Connie's in the honeymoon period. But at some point, there are going to have to be cuts, and he is reviewing federal departments at the moment. Where could that potentially happen? How is he going to?
They made a choice not to present a budget. Which anybody objectively on the surface would say, all of us, whether it's a family or a business or a province, we have a budget because then we have a plan. But in the case of the federal government, we also have a budget so all of the people dependent on that federal government can understand the future, because there are many, many other plans at the provincial level, at the agency level, among businesses and others that need to know. That said, I think we can understand why keeping that flexibility open in this period didn't create the distraction of answering a number of questions, one of which is exactly the question you're asking, which is, how are you going to pay for all this? One imagines as well that there's a hope that in an environment where there is more stability, ideally where there is some certainty with all the provisos we said relative to trade and other things, the continued significant deficits, which are almost inevitably going to be a part of any at least short and medium term plan, will be easier and easier for the bond markets to stomach in the context of more stability. And you could argue that saying you're going to spend a bunch of money, but you're not sure what you're going to do on how to spend it, or presenting a plan that way that isn't complete, might not have been the best plan for now. So, but the big federal expenditures, obviously there's a significant amount of money that's spent on people. And I think, you've seen the Prime Minister bring in a very top flight team in terms of his senior advisors, whether it's Mr. Sabia or his chief of staff or others. These are very credible, competent individuals who've dealt with large organizations and government. But I think that is going to be a major conversation about the size and scope of a federal government that grew a lot really through COVID and hasn't right-sized in some people's minds. And there are also significant costs around transfers. And those transfers are to provinces. And most of them are for things like healthcare. So these, this is where I guess this newfound sense of unity, and I think the relationships that the Prime Minister and the Premiers are building, and the ministers, because remember, there's the relationship at the Prime Minister's level. Those then drive relationships at the minister's level. Federal Minister of Health, all the provincial ministers of health. Federal Minister of Environment, all the provincial ministers. I think the premiers and the Prime Minister are sending the tone from the top.
Okay.
Let's get along. It's easier to get along until someone says, by the way, we're going to do a 5% cut, in your transfer. And so this will likely be the challenge of the fall, assuming that the federal government provides clarity around the plan. And getting back to the tactics, it starts to become understandable why the federal government might not have wanted to try to solidify that plan right now with all this uncertainty with the federal budget.
Sort of get what they can now and
build some goodwill. Get
momentum,
everybody going in the right direction, and deal with the tougher stuff. But a lot of that, again, the direction of the economy will drive the tax revenues. Principal drivers of revenue, like the biggest single hit at the federal or provincial level is a change in the trajectory of the economy, which affects first business taxes, which are a huge component of the overall taxes for the federal government, things like the sales tax, right? So the direction of that come the fall could be a big indicator of just how far one needs to go on the cutting side.
Interesting. Switching to the US perhaps, where they started with the hard stuff first, and maybe there's the better stuff coming down the road. Tariffs have obviously been the big focus right now. We have July 9th coming up, which is when the reciprocal tariffs that have been on hold come back into play. That was Liberation Day 90 days ago, and the markets came down pretty hard at that time. Markets have actually been rallying to all-time highs despite this deadline coming up next Wednesday. I think basically there's an underlying assumption that a lot of this is going to be bumped again, and in other cases there might be a 10% global tariff, which is perhaps manageable and a lot of countries can deal with, and then this issue can move to the sidelines. I'm curious if you think this goes away, or is this going to be around for the next year?
Listen, I think that's right in terms of the analysis of why we are where we are. I think, President Trump is been showing strength and is very strong right now. And on the foreign policy front, on the with the U.S. military and with the attack in Iran and the seeming, at least, end to that conflict for now, and the assertion of American military strength. But also, I mean, just anybody who's watching the news, like, it moves and shakes, and the world moves based on what he's saying. And to the extent that he can manage that domestically and get his big, beautiful bill through, with many, challenging questions about how that will work and how it will affect people. As we sit here today, it is making its way through, and that again will assert his strength. And I think that sends a message that people want to hear. Now, it's always I think we've talked before about when I look at politicians and political leaders, you look at what they say, you look at what they do, and you also look at what happens as a result and what other people do around it. And I really do think that there's a third component there that we can't anticipate about all the other factors that have been unleashed in the world and how that can actually unfold. I think there's a pretty high probability that's going to lead to some uncertainty, right? Because that strength will, motivate some people, frighten others, and create probably uncertainty that we can't anticipate right now. And that will have effects on the markets. But as we sit here today, the president looks strong. He is behaving like he knows what he's doing. And I think the markets and a lot of people want to believe that's true. And we'll find out.
Yeah. And perhaps that's part of the reason we've seen the US dollar weakness. Considerable sort of slide from that standpoint is because there are questions what's going to happen in the US down the road with a standpoint.
I mean, one of the topics we talked about, the Federal Reserve and what happens there, there are some linchpins. One does get the sense a much more confident versus and much more, regardless of what you think of him, he's more of a plan and a more confident Trump 2.0 is testing the areas where he can have impact and where he should back away from. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting in his treatment of the Federal Reserve Chair and what he says about what I'll do and what I won't do, and then he's gauging a response. You can see it in his interventions in different global affairs, where he'll go on Truth Social at 2 a.m. and suddenly start telling Hamas what they better do, right? And you get the sense that he's willing to take some risks, but I think we'd be wrong not to think that he's observing the cause and effect. Where it works and where it doesn't. And some things, like some of the Federal Reserve commentary, some of that has had in some cases, a negative effect. So you can back away a little bit. And then 2 weeks later, push a bit again. It'll be interesting to see how that actually affects things like interest rates in the U.S.
He's very much controlling the narrative. So if he wants to move it away from tariffs, you always know something else is going to happen. And something like Iran comes up rather than having to make an announcement at the end of the G7 that wasn't going to be there, leave early and change the headlines to something else.
And this may be the most important takeaway, because it's very hard to know where that mind will go. Except what we do see is he is a master of what I've heard referred to as the attention economy. He knows that what he says, he knows what to say and where to say it and how to say it to move that agenda. So he's getting on the plane and he goes, we're not going to get a deal with Japan because they won't buy our rice.
Cool.
Suddenly and so I think it'd be wrong to think these aren't conscious considerations, but it'd be also wrong to think that anybody could understand the implications of all of those tied up. And I get back to those three: people say, what they do. And I think Trump, by and large, has been pretty committed to the things he said he would do in the campaign, for those paying attention to what he's doing. Still, the reaction of the rest of the world, of other leaders, bond markets, these are things that are beyond anybody's control.
And I think you're seeing that, like I said, with the US dollar, but certainly you're seeing, Europe will make some concessions. Canada's going to make some concessions, but at the same time, they realize Europe and Canada are going to have to trade more. They're going to have to explore different avenues down the road to some extent. I did want to touch on the Federal Reserve, but before we get there, the one big beautiful bill, July 4th, to Trump's self-imposed deadline, may or may not get there. It's been to the Senate, now it's back at the House right now. Just your thoughts on the implications from that standpoint. And
listen, we'll see as we're sitting here, it isn't passed yet, and there may still be some adjustments around the edges. But I think we can say certain things for certain. The tax cut is going to continue. I think that is most important in the exception. If that wasn't the case, I think that would have been, it was always a sense in the macro that whatever impact the tariffs would have, the continuation of the tax cut would signal to the signal for investors and for businesses about a positive tax environment, particularly from an investor perspective. There is, of course, in that bill, many, many other things, including immigration. That's why it's the one big, beautiful bill. It includes a lot of other. I think we are now starting to see an interesting mixed signals out of the U.S. labor market, but we are certainly, I think, more than just anecdotally hearing about potential issues around labor shortages in certain sectors that have been heavily reliant on illegal work and cross-border flow. And so I think those are still to be, again, huge impact on a huge economy, big sectors of that economy that are impacted, whether it's in hospitality or in agriculture or other places. So I think that this will again solidify some of those things, and those will become realities. And I think, the ability of this president to get done what he says he's going to get done. I mean, again, that underlying that, whatever people think about it, is that going to be the certainty? We're not sure what it'll be, but we know it'll be what Trump wants. Well, that is a form of certainty. And this is a case where there were many, many people who said he wouldn't get this done. Mm-hmm. If he does, and it looks like he will, then I think that sends a signal about strength. Right? And I think in general, from a business and investor perspective, now there are segments like the renewable space and that where there are huge negative implications. But in terms of a business clarity and a business focus, you couldn't really say that there's been a more business-focused president who's trying to create an environment. And if you're in line with that environment, if you own windmills, not so good. But other than that, it's going to probably be a positive signal. And I think markets will probably reflect that.
And they are to some extent with all-time highs. And again, deregulation was a huge theme in his first term, and we did see concrete results there. Hasn't been the focus yet. But I think of his legislative agenda, like I said, this is one bill with everything in it. What happens after that? He's got a lot of time to... what does he focus on next?
And to some extent, I think the idea of the midterms are not that far away in U.S. political terms. The idea was if it works or it doesn't, there's great concern, particularly being voiced by the Democrats about what this will do to Medicare, the cost reduction, the hit on individuals. All of these things will start to play themselves out. But overlying that, because there's the reality on the ground, will be the narrative. And I think it's fair to say that the president and the Republicans have been controlling that narrative. Now, reality hits. If inflation is the result of labor shortages and, the tariff impacts and those things, and people's prices go up when they're buying a quart of milk, well, they'll know that. And on the other hand, if businesses start to invest, people start to see new factories opening up and they're hearing new jobs. I mean, I saw unemployment still under 5%. I mean, it's a remarkably low unemployment rate by every other.
Numbers today again.
So these will be realities, but from the perspective of a government moving quickly lets the positive impacts, because I don't imagine they're doing anything that they think will be bad. They obviously think it's a good idea. I guess we'll find out. And if it is, you'll see those impacts by the time the midterms roll around.
And one of those impacts actually we're hearing as far as the Federal Reserve Chairman Powell, his term ends early next year, and Trump is talking about naming a successor soon to act as a sort of shadow Fed governor, which could have significant implications as far as Trump trying to sort of control the Federal Reserve, because that does decrease confidence in the U.S. monetary policy and its bonds. And so where does this go to some extent as far as broader?
So I think in the context of what we've been talking about, which is that idea of knowing what's going to happen, I don't think anybody thinks that Powell, and I think that many would argue either sides, but generally I think he's been strong, probably a little too late on the inflation, would put up one case. But I don't think anybody believes that 2 years from now he's going to be the chair of the Fed. So knowing what is going to be the environment will probably, again, have a positive reaction, right, from people, right? I think that becomes, now, the big if is who, right? And I think what has often happened with Trump, and it'll be interesting to see in these cases, we've seen some very doctrinaire partisan appointments that have truly troubled people. I'd use examples like the FBI, where people are deeply concerned by those things. We've also seen some appointments like his Secretary of Commerce and others that have given people confidence. And said, that's, hopefully it trends to the latter. Then I think probably it takes some risk out, right? It's not going to be, the one economist who everybody thinks is crazy. And remember, the Federal Reserve is a structure that has other members as well.
There's 12 governors, exactly.
And so even to have it operate well, it needs to have someone who is credible.
And the chairman has one vote to some extent.
So it'll, so again, the uncertainty may be about there being someone who'd be inappropriate
Yeah.
If it's someone people go like, huh. And there's been some names thrown around, and who knows who it'll be. So because Powell isn't going to be there in a time frame that the markets care about, because they care more about it than a year from now, probably some certainty.
Yeah.
Now, you could easily get into the two, you can't have two chairs at once. But I think people might feel better knowing, assuming the answer is an answer they want to hear.
An answer they want to hear, exactly. Perhaps before we wrap up, bringing you back to Canada, just sort of what are we looking for the next few weeks over the summer break? Certainly on the economic side, we've got Q2 earnings coming out, and that's going to be really interesting because Q1 companies didn't want to give guidance. There was a lot of uncertainty about tariffs. It'd be really interesting to see if they're starting to open up about what their business, if they're starting to spend again. So from an economic standpoint, that's probably a key aspect. July 9th, obviously, reciprocal tariffs coming off. How does the market handle that? Do we have any big announcements? Do we have another rug pull potentially with some of the trading partners?
I think you've hit everything that people will be watching, and then I guess it's going to be the macro environment of what's happening in the world. I think that the likely best outcome from a Canadian trade perspective is going to be a relatively good deal, which is sustainable and people believe will be the deal, therefore providing certainty.
Yes.
One of the interesting parts about that is the relatively good, right?
Yeah.
And so that would suggest also knowing what's going on. We saw the UK with an early, somewhat deal, but it was hard to judge because against what, right? How did you do compared to to other people, and how will Canada fare and how will Mexico fare in the context of two proximate places? What is going on with China, which is the big complex question, and what, if any, limitations will there be on Canada, and are they willing to accept relative to other trading partners, principally China, which is one of our largest trading partners, I think our second largest. So I think those are all questions that I don't think will necessarily be answered in the next few weeks, but that will be the final context of success. How well did Canada do? Is it sustainable? And can we still succeed as an economy? And what limitations, if any, and I think there will probably be some, have we accepted? And let's be clear, like Canada as part of the Western Alliance and as part of a country that's proximate to the United States has always accepted a certain amount of restriction and alignment around what happens in the United States.
Yes.
But how codified will that be? And, to the point you started with, which I thought was a good one, how will that be done?
Yeah.
Again, with this government, there tends to be a little bit of a slap on the face as that gets happened. That might be harder to take for Canadians who have been more patriotically engaged. And I think that'll be an important balance that I think the Prime Minister will need. He'll need the help of the premiers to manage it.
Yeah. Anything else he'll be working on over the summer, or is that kind of his number one job?
I think if we got to Labor Day and there was clarity on the investment climate and the trade climate on a relative basis where Canada came out well, I think he'd consider that a pretty successful summer. But of course, like any other government, there's still staffing of offices, making sure the bureaucracy. I anticipate, I think the ministers and no doubt the deputy ministers federally seem to be put on a very, expectations. And I wouldn't be shocked, not by the end of the summer, but in a reasonably short term, to see there being winners and losers. There'll be people who are successful and people who aren't. This is a prime minister and as well his senior bureaucrats who sent the signal, we're going to get things done. And one of the ways that you show people what happens, is to demonstrate both the successes and the failures. So we might see some shifts there. But for the average Canadian, I think sorting out what's happening to the south, I think it would be a very good summer if that was done by. I'm not optimistic it will be, but we know there's going to be progress, right? And what happens with China? As that,
I'm more of an optimist, so I'm hopeful on that one. So always a great discussion.
Ben,
thank you, and thank you for joining us.